on the coast, and they had taken the town, but the Germans had poisoned all the water supplies, the wells, all that stuff. You couldn't drink it, and the guys were getting really thirsty. So this guy, I'm trying to think of his name now. He was a fighter pilot flying for the Royal Canadian Air Force in Spitfires, and it'll come to me in a second. So his officer goes to him that day, and he says, I need you to take your slipper tank, 90-gallon slipper tank, over to the mechanics, steam clean it out, get it clean, then take it to the officer's mess, fill it with beer, and we have to fly it over to this newly liberated field at Benny-sur-Mer so the guys can have something to drink. I mean, how Canadian is that? They send beer, right? So he takes off in his airplane. He flies to about 12 or 14,000 feet, lands at the airfield because he wants it. He gets it up that high so it'll be cold. Nobody wants to drink warm beer. So he gets and lands on the airfield, turns around, and there's nobody around. He can't find anybody. And suddenly from behind a tree, this little tiny corporal comes running out, jumps up on the wing root, and knocks on the plexiglass. So he slides the canopy back. He says, what are you doing? He said, I'm here to bring you something to drink. I've got 90 gallons worth of beer. And the soldier looked at him and said, you see that church at the other end of the runway? Yeah. Well, that church steeple's full of German snipers. We haven't had a chance to clean it out yet. And if you don't get out of here now, you won't. So he dropped the tank on the ground and took off. And that was the first Allied aircraft to land in liberated France after D-Day. Now, I met that gentleman in 2012. Yeah, come on. I'll think of his name. Anyway, I went to Cops Coliseum to be part of the military tattoo down there. The boys had come back from Afghanistan, the Hamilton Light Infantry, which is a very storied thing of their own, history of their own. And in the foyer are all the people who deal in war memorabilia, like cap badges and helmets and all that kind of stuff. People collect that thing, and so there's this big crowd milling around, and there's a guy standing there on a chair, holding up a 3x5 plaque with a Spitfire on it, painted, and he's saying to the crowd, I even put his squadron number on it right here, along with the D-Day stripes and all that. This is as close to a real picture of this airplane as I could possibly make it. And I turned to look, and here's this short little white-haired guy, about 5 feet. And I said, I'm looking at the painting. I'm looking at this guy. And so I go over to him, and I said, excuse me, I don't mean to sound disrespectful, but who are you? And he told me his name. And my jaw dropped because I had just finished writing that story and recording it back at the radio station in Ottawa. And I said, you got to be kidding. So we grabbed a couple chairs in the middle of these 200 or 300 people, and we sat there, and I explained to him what I had done. I only had one line to build the story around, but I knew how the Air Force worked. I knew how the Spitfire, what the Spitfire could do. I knew about slipper tanks and all that. So I built a story based on that one line. And he said, I said, I just wanted to check with you, make sure I got everything right. He said, yes, you got it all. You got it exactly right. There's only one thing you could not have known. And I said, what was that? He said, when I swung my Spitfire around to take off, the gun sights landed on the steeple of the church. If I had pulled the trigger, I had 250 caliber machine guns and 220 millimeter cannons. I could have blown that steeple right off the church. I said, well, why didn't you? It's full of snipers. He said, because after 4 years of war under the Nazi heel, the French needed that church more than I needed to take out those snipers. And that story choked me up on the spot. I mean, here's a real hero. He went on to win the Croix de Guerre. He won the Distinguished Flying Cross. This was a guy who was wearing medals that actually meant something. And I had the honor and with the privilege of sitting with him and talking about that experience. And I'll never forget it.
That's a fascinating story, Nick.
I just wish I could remember his name.
I don't know. We'll find it. We'll find it.
Yep, we will.
So, D-Day. One of the things that has I've seen more of in the media and in popular culture these days in reference to D-Day, and that is a little bit of pushback, if you will, on the claim that, D-Day was the penultimate invasion of Europe. We saved Europe from Nazi Germany. And Americans in particular are like to talk that way, as if D-Day was all about the United States. In fact, the Americans only landed on 2 beaches.
And they very nearly got thrown back into the sea at one of them.
Right, yes. So anyway, that's kind of the narrative. But the pushback has been, and I don't think it's entirely without merit, the pushback has been, really the Soviets were so powerful at that time that they probably would have conquered National Socialist Germany without the Western Allies having to invade France. So D-Day was not necessarily the decisive battle that, at least initially, it was portrayed as. And I'm not unsympathetic to that argument. But having said that, Nick, an aspect of D-Day that I think is forgotten, not just forgotten, it's never talked about, and that is that while it may be true that the Russians could have beaten the Germans without the D-Day landings in the West, and I say may be true because, let's face facts, the Germans had to have a lot of soldiers and material, etc., stationed in Western Europe to repel an invasion for a number of years, let alone actually fight off an invasion come D-Day. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the perception is true, that the Russians probably would have beaten the Germans without that particular event. What would not have happened, though, is that Western Europe would not have retained its freedom after the war. In other words, if what Canadians and British and Americans did on D-Day and subsequent to D-Day was they saved the freedom of France, Holland, Belgium, Denmark, and ultimately Austria, Czechoslovakia. Well, the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, did end up being under the Soviet sphere. Italy, and this is an aspect of D-Day that was not planned, it was not anticipated, but in retrospect, I think that we can honor those soldiers, those people who fought and died, and those who lived, for having saved freedom in Europe post-World War II.
Now, I have found the name, remembered the name of the fighter pilot I was talking to. His name was Lloyd Frederick Berryman.
Okay.
He had the Distinguished Flying Cross and Bar from the British Commonwealth, the Croix de Guerre from France, and had, best I can determine from the website I'm looking at, he had 4 aerial victories and 3 damaged. So he didn't end quite as an ace, but he was a remarkable man. Really a very gentle. I was talking to his I don't want to call her a nurse, but someone who, looked after him, because the guy at the time was in his late 80s. And she said, oh, he's nothing but Spitfire. You go to his basement, and it's Spitfire from front to back. He loved that plane. So we had a lot to talk about that day. Now, there's something else, too. Your comments about the role that the way that things unfolded in D-Day. There's been a lot of media surrounding D-Day in recent years, in movies especially. One of the great classic movies about that event, because how can you not tell that story, right? And I thought overall, from a historical point of view, they did a pretty good job. Because some movies based on, different periods in time take some liberties, some real stretches of history. But in this particular case, the movie's called The Longest Day. Everybody in it represents a real character. There were people like John Wayne in it. There was some very famous German actors that were in it.
Right, Nick, I'm going to interrupt you for a second because I'm just looking at the time. Let's hold on to that thought. Let's go take our break, and then come back and we'll pick the discussion up when we come back, if that's okay with you. So, ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned. We'll be back in a few minutes here on the Nick and Joe Show on the Think Radio Broadcast Network.